It's 7 o'clock. Glad you're here. Tonight certainly been a beautiful day for us. We'll begin with a word of prayer. And Stephen Peavy, would you lead some prayer, please? Amen. Well, announced last week we was going to cover the topic of how we got the Bible. The Bible that you have in your hand or maybe on your phone or iPad or whatever you're using. How did we come about getting that was written several hundred or thousand, a couple of thousand years ago? How do we go about getting it? Well, the word Bible simply means a collection of books. That's the definition of the Bible, what it is. It so happened that the books that are in what we call the Bible are inspired. They are God-breathed. That's what inspiration means. God had a hand in making sure that we had a hand. We each have a copy of it if one wants a copy of it. But you could take another collection of books. You may have a collection of recipes. You might call that the Bible as well. But doesn't mean it's inspired. It just means it's a collection of books. So the Bible simply means a collection of books, and the books consist of letters that these either prophets wrote or apostles wrote, and they were taken and they're put together in one. So we have those that the prophets or apostles or other inspired men wrote. Now, these letters or books that we have, they were taken from manuscripts. You have letters that Paul wrote to the churches. Well, there's a letter out there that he wrote, and then at some point, some other congregation said, I'd like to have a copy of that. Well, they copied it down as well, made a copy of it. And then they began to circulate these, and therefore, at some point, somebody said, we need to put these in a book form so we can have them all together. And that's how they began to do this. Now, they did it in the Old Testament first because, of course, they were written first. And they were in book form. And then as the New Testament began to grow and as letters were circulated, at some point somebody said, we're going to put these in book form as well. And that's why we have the 27 books of the New Testament, or letters or books as we might want to call them. Now, to our knowledge, we do not have the original letters in the New Testament or the letters of the Old Testament. We don't have the original. What we do have is the things that go back. The older you can find one, the better off you'll be as far as it being accurate. But if we do have the original letters, maybe that Paul wrote, well, we don't know it. Because who knows what Paul's autograph looked like? If he signed it, if he even signed it. A lot of times in his writings, he would write Paul, an apostle. He'd start that way. But we don't know if he signed them or not. None of them are dated, anything like that. So we don't know if we have the original or not. We could have out there somewhere in some manuscript in letter form. So what we do, we just try to take the oldest manuscripts that we have, because the older the manuscript, the more accurate those manuscripts would be. So we take over the oldest, and that's where we start. And we begin to try to figure out, break down if it's Hebrew, break it into English. What does the Hebrew mean? Or if it's the Greek in the New Testament, we begin to break it down and put it in English form as well, and trying to get the most accurate. Now, there's all kind of different manuscripts out there. You have some that are written in stone, carved in stone. You can imagine how long it would take. Now, they would last, but how long would it take a person to write these in stone? So they date around 1500 BC when man started chiseling words in stone. We have some in clay, and they date to around 650 BC. Clay is good, but it can become very brittle. You can imagine dropping it and it going into 1,000 pieces. But we have that. We have clay manuscripts, and they date back to 650 BC. We have some in wood. A person would carve in such wood. Well, they date to around 500 BC. Leather, they did some in leather, which is sometimes you look at animal skin, as we'll see in a minute, but we don't really have a good date on those. But there were some old that written on leather with some kind of ink. Papyrus was the most popular form that was used. Papyrus was a plant. It was named papyrus. And they would take this plant, and they would beat it and crush it and wash it. And it would come in a pretty whitish form, and then they would dry it, and they would make this in a 9-inch by 30-inch rolls. That's what it was formed into. A scroll, as we might call it today. And that's what a lot of the Old Testament was written on. They had scrolls. When Christ would go to the temple, he would read. He would take out a scroll. He would unravel it. And he would read in a certain place. And of course, during this time, it wasn't broken down into chapter and verses, Old or New Testament, as far as that goes. So it would be a little bit difficult to take this scroll and maybe you wanted to read in the last foot of that scroll. So you got to wind up 29 foot, and then you begin to read. So it wasn't that easy to do, but that's all they knew. And that's how they put the Bible out at that time. And then you have papyrus codex. Codex just means it's in book form or paper form. That's all that means. Papyrus codex made the same way, except now they got smart, and let's put this in sheets. I don't know what size, different sizes, I guess, but 8.5 by 11. They're a lot easier to carry around, 8.5 by 11, and it would be something a 9-inch by 30-foot roll. And that we find those around 200 AD, sheets. Vellum also came about around 200 AD. That's thin animal skin. Animal skin they would take and simply put ink on it and write the Bible or these letters or things on such. And then around 750, that's when paper came out. They began to use paper, pretty much sort of like what we use today. And so there's the different types of manuscripts that we would have. Now you could tell in some ways by how old they were by what was written on them. Take, for example, it might be that a manuscript was signed and dated. You went and borrowed one from a church somewhere, and you copied it word for word. You might sign it, put your name on it. I copied this on this particular date in this particular location. So that's how some can be dated. They are signed and dated, these older manuscripts. The size of the letters. At different time periods, they use different size letters. It's sort of like today, you go back to some of the earlier printers that we would have on computers. They would have a different kind of font to them, maybe little bitty dots to make up the letters. And now things are different, so you could date it by if you look at a piece of paper, by how old it is, what kind of size of letters or how the letters are printed on a piece of paper. Punctuation, that didn't come till later on. So if you get a manuscript that's punctuated, you know this is about when it was written. That's when they started doing these things. And then spacing between words. A lot of these, the Greek writings, there was no spacing between the words. All the words ran together. And you'd have to be, if you were used to it, you can handle it. But if you were to give somebody a copy of that today in English and all the words are run together, we might even have a little difficulty trying to read it, trying to figure out where does the word end, where does the next word begin. But that's how the space between these words began. So that would tell you something about the age of the manuscript itself. Now, there are two types of manuscripts. You have the unicals and you have the cursives. These unicals, what we have now, are about 300 in number. And they date around 100 to 300 AD. That's the oldest that we have from the New Testament. The cursives, we have discovered around 4,200 of them. And the dates on those range from 700 AD to 1400 AD. So we have a lot more cursive than we do the unicals. But the unicals are older, so therefore the thinking is they're more accurate. It's sort of like if somebody in the back would tell a secret and we start passing that thing around, whispering to somebody's ear. By the time it got up to here, it might be changed a little bit. Well, these unicals, 300 of them, the old ones, they're pretty accurate. Very accurate that we have. Now, here's an example of a unical. This is Hebrew, written in Hebrew here. You can see all the words are run together, it's pretty much in block form. That's how, if you found one, you need to know how to read it. A cursive, it sort of runs this way, maybe in two paragraphs. We might call it two strips. Again, pretty much in block form, and that would be a little different way that they were written. So that's how we tell the difference in a unical and a cursive. Again, as time progressed, the writing began to change. Now here's one of the oldest completed Bibles that we have, almost complete. It's the Codex Sinaiticus. And the reason it's called, remember, Codex just means it's written in book form. The Sinaiticus, it was found in a monastery at the foot of Mount Sinai. It was found in 1844. That's when this book was found. But they go back and start dating it, and it starts around 300 AD. It's when this was put together, when the old and the old both together. So this is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, handwritten, completed New Testament and almost complete Old Testament that we have. The Codex Sinaiticus. And the reason that it is not a complete Old Testament is in 1844, you had some of these Greek scholars that began to go to these monasteries, and they realized that they're finding a lot of old stuff in these monasteries. Good stuff, original writings. And they were thinking, the original manuscripts, the original letters may be here somewhere. So they start looking. And they go to this monastery at the foot of Mount Sinai, and there's one of these monks sitting by the fireplace, pulling out pages of the Old Testament and starting fires with it. Kindling is what they were using it for. These monks did not know what they had. And no telling how many they burned. They could have burned the original letters that these apostles wrote. Could have. Don't know. So these Greek scholars find these things, and they say, you need to stop this. You got something here worth a lot. And they did. They stopped. And they began going to all these different monasteries and other different places. And that's where they began to find, year after year, more and more and more of these manuscripts. Some of them unicals, some of them the cursives, They began to find more of these. So the more they had, the more they could start comparing one to the other and just see how accurate these are. So they began to compare these books. Here's another old one, the Codex Vaticanus. It dates around 300 as well, 300 to 450. And it was stored in the Vatican in Rome. That's where they found it at. And it was 1867. You couldn't look at it unless you were somebody special, unless you were the Pope or a king or a priest or something like that, very high-known priest. You couldn't even look at it. But in 1867, they finally allowed people to come in and make a copy, a little bit of it. Not much, but a little bit of it. In 1890 was the first time they allowed it to be completely copied from front to back. Now this is, again, an almost completed Old Testament and a complete New Testament put together. But prior to this, prior to 1867, when they let anybody even look at it, if you wanted to look at it, you'd only allow 2 hours to look at it. You went to a room, you were searched, you couldn't carry any writing utensil with you, you couldn't carry any paper with you. You were searched. You had 2 guards that went with you in this room. It was set before you, and those guards were looking at you as you looked at it. And if you stayed on any one verse too long, I don't know what too long would be, you were escorted out. They didn't want the people, at least the Catholic Church, didn't want the people to know what was written in the Bible. Because they knew that if people began to read it, they're going to see a lot of things that aren't true that the Catholic Church has been teaching for all these centuries. They would figure it out. So they were very strict to what was being read, and especially in this particular case here, this Codex Vaticanus. Now, the 4 oldest manuscripts that we know, of course, the Codex Sinaiticus, the Codex Vaticanus. There's no one there, Alexandrius and the Ephraimia. There's their dates. Those are the oldest manuscripts that we have, that we can go back and begin to compare these and what's written here and compare to the versions that we have today. Because the versions that we have today, at least some of them, came right here from these 4 particular copies. And here's what we have. We have the original manuscripts, which we don't have. We don't think we do. Then you have the unicals, the old ones. Then you got the cursives. They're old too, but not like the unicals. Now, whenever these versions here were written, the Revised Standard Version, American Standard Version, the English Version, King James Version, we're probably familiar with those 4, but you got Moffat and Goodspeed. They used the unicals. They said, we want to find the oldest that are there. They're going to be the most accurate. And that's what we want to use. So these 6 versions here, that's what they used. Now, other Bibles, the Tyndale, or the Great Bible, or Bishop's Bible, they used these other manuscripts, the cursives. That's what they used. And they probably used some of the Revised Standard, or American Standard, or English Version, or King James as well to compare put all this together. So these versions here, the first ones on the unicals, they're good versions, very good versions. You can feel confident that the manuscripts they used were old. I mean, the oldest you could find. Now, I want us to look at the King James. That's probably the more popular one. I don't know if anybody here has a Revised Standard Version, good version, or American Standard Version, very good version. English version, that's good as well, but most of us are very familiar with the King James Version. Whenever the King James said, I want a Bible in English, he had 54 scholars to go and find these unicals. But all they had at that time available to them were only 25 unicals. That's all they had. Well, others had not been discovered yet. They're out here in other places waiting to be discovered. So King James gets 54 scholars, not just one, 54, puts them in a room, and they go through the process of making sure this is right and back-checking one another, and that's very good. They use the old versions, the old manuscript, and then they use 54 of them, and here they go. They're finding these things out. Now, the first version is a 1611 version. And if you have a King James Version, you don't have that one. Because if you had the 1611, it would be difficult to read because it's in the old King's English. But that version was revised. I say revised, it was just the wording was made to fit the time in 1638, in 1762, and 1769. If you have a King James Version, the version you have is a 1769 version. That's what you have. It's not the 1611 or 29 or 38 version or 1762. It's a 1769. Now here's what the 1611 version would read, how it would read. One particular verse. Let's say 1 Thessalonians 4:15. And these are not typos. These are the way it's written. That we which are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord shall not prevent them which are asleep. Now, some words spelled a little different than how we spell them today. But the 1769 version is what, if you have one, that's what it is. That we which are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord shall not prevent them which are asleep. Now, we understand the lettering. We understand the word. And it's easy to understand. And you're taking nothing away from the true meaning of it. It's just put in English that we understand. Then in 1983, you have the New King James Version that came out. Now, they didn't just go and take the King James Version and just change a few words to make it fit today's language. There were 130 Bible scholars that took the King James Version and also went back to these unicals, these old manuscripts, and by the time of 1983, they got 300 of them. Remember, the King James scholars just had 54. They just had 25. Well, when these 130 put it all together, they got somewhat 300 that have been found. They can use and verify things, and that's what they did. And they verified that the King James Version certainly fits. It's certainly accurate as it goes back to those early manuscripts. A very good version. And then they have the New King James Version, which took some words and put it a little more into our today's English instead of the 1769 English. As we see there, the New King James Version, 1 Thessalonians 4:15, that we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord will by no means precede those who are asleep. And this is talking here about the second coming of the Lord, the resurrection, and such here. So, and with the exception of a few words, that the 1983 New King James is pretty much the same. Now these scholars, they found a few words that they wanted to put in the original Greek, such as Acts 12 and verse 4. Here's how the King James Version reads. When he had apprehended him, he put him in prison, delivered him to 4 squadrons of soldiers to keep him, intending after Easter to bring him forth to the people. Now, the New King James reads this way. So when he had arrested him, he put him in prison, delivered him to 4 squads of soldiers to keep him, intending to bring him before the people after Passover. When this was happening, when Paul was put in prison, they didn't have Easter. They had Passover. But when these scholars wrote, Easter was a part of it's part of their everyday language. So instead of Passover, they put Easter in there. And Easter falls at Passover. But the New King James uses the word Passover, which is the correct word, you might say, that goes back to the original Greek. So there the word is used. And there are a few little places like this, little words, but it doesn't change the meaning at all. And so if you use the King James Version, great version, New King James, that's one I use. That's just the wording's a little easier to read because I was learning how to read what little bit I can read from, today's English, not the 1769 English. Now here's what some early Christian writers had to say about the completion of the Bible. Justin Martyr, who was a Christian writer who wrote in 150 A.D., he mentions the memoirs of the apostles were being read in the Christian worship assemblies, the memoirs. So at 150, the New Testament was completed. It was completed by then and being passed around and read in the churches. Good thing. Here's called a Muratorian fragment. That's just a piece of a writing that was found. And it said, dating around 150, it mentions the book of Luke as the third gospel. It also puts in order John, Acts, and Paul's 13 letters, just how we have it today. So there, the early church, as early as 150, they had the completed Bible, and they were using it. Of course, it was written in Greek at that early time, but it was completed at least by 150. It was completed. And then Origen, who was a Christian scholar who lived between 185 and 253 A.D., in his writings, he names all 27 books of the New Testament. I don't know when he actually did his writing, but maybe around 200 when he started writing, age 15, I don't know, or later. He mentions all 27 books. So the completed Bible that we have today, there are good versions, very good versions out there. There's some that aren't so good. And what sometimes happens, you have a denomination who will say, we want a Bible to be written by our people. And they'll get their people to write a new version, such as the NIV, and they get that new version, and it is slant toward their beliefs, toward their doctrines. Whereas these earlier writers, the King James Version, American Standard, Revised Standard, they didn't do that. They had all these scholars, all these manuscripts. They put it together to be a very accurate version that we have. And so you got to be careful what version you get, because it may be slanted toward this particular group's beliefs. And we don't want that. We want to get back to the original best as we can to make sure that it works. And it's something as important as our salvation. I just know that God made sure that we have a good copy of it, an accurate copy. And it leaves it up to us to make sure that it's accurate, that we do our study of the actual, whatever one we're going to use. Let's study and see how did it come about. What did they use to find all these, to write the Bible as we know it today. Any comment, thought on how we got the Bible? I think so. Yes. And they had the system how they wrote was once they got the original copy, we'll say, especially the Old Testament, you had a scholar or scribe that would come in and he would write, he'd have it over here, and he would write. Well, after he got it written, somebody would begin to check. He had to write, he had to have the same amount of lines on each page, the same amount of words on each sentence. You had checkers who would come in and they would check the amount of lines, the amount of sentences. They would check how many words that were used compared to the original. They would check how many, count the letters. I mean, it wasn't just something they threw together. These people during the Old Testament times and the early New Testament times took this stuff very serious. This was the Word of God. And they want to make sure they got it right. Because if they didn't, if they for some reason, let me change this a little bit, well, somebody would check them and it may cost them their life to do that. They take it a lot more serious than people do today. And we have it, and we got many copies of it, and we throw it around here and there. They didn't do so. And when they got that old copy, especially the Old Testament, when they got the new one, they would take the old one and they had a ceremonial burial of that. They just didn't leave them laying around. They took them and they buried them in a very ceremonial way because they respected it that much. Just how we at least should respect our flag. You just don't go out here and destroy a flag. There's ceremonial things you go through. If one gets old and raggy and torn up, you just don't throw it in trash. And they didn't throw these old copies of what they copied from, just leave them laying around. They respected the Word of God tremendously. All right, next week, a gospel meeting. It'll be the last night of our meeting next week. And in 2 weeks, we're going to try to answer the question, where did God come from? Where did He come from? And we'll talk about that in 2 weeks.